I used to think retirement would feel like slipping into a warm bath. Quiet mornings, coffee on the porch, maybe a fishing trip or two. After 40 years of steel-toed boots and sore backs, I pictured myself sitting in the bleachers at high school games, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I pictured Florida sunshine in February. I pictured rest. But life, as it often does, had another plan. It was a Tuesday evening when my daughter knocked on my door. Her eyes darted everywhere but mine. In her hands were two little backpacks, one pink, one blue, and behind her, half hidden, stood my grandkids, 7 and 9, confused, clutching each other like shipwreck survivors. She said she needed time. She said she couldn't handle it anymore. And before I could wrap my head around what it meant, she was gone. Just like that. I remember standing there in the doorway, my two grandkids staring up at me, their faces pale and small. I had never felt my house so quiet, so suddenly heavy. I wanted to call after her, demand she explain herself, beg her to stay. But all I could do was kneel down, open my arms, and let those kids fold themselves into me. That night my retirement ended. You don't plan for moments like that. You don't save for them in a 401k. You don't circle a date on the calendar and write, "This is the day you give up the rest of your life for the ones you love." But when the choice came, golf clubs or grandkids, there was no choice at all. I pulled out my savings account, the one I had guarded for decades like a secret garden. I watched the numbers shrink as I paid for sneakers, for school lunches, for backpacks that always seemed to rip at the seams. I learned how much two growing kids could eat. I learned how much braces cost. I learned that love, the real kind, doesn't ask for a receipt. Still, there were nights when I sat alone at the kitchen table, after they'd gone to bed, staring at the unpaid bills. My hands ached from the warehouse job I picked up on weekends. My eyes burned from the double shifts. And in those hours, I would whisper to myself, this wasn't how it was supposed to be. But then I'd hear the soft snore of my grandson down the hall, or I'd see the glow of the nightlight under my granddaughter's door, and I would remember this wasn't about me anymore. This was about them having a home, not just a roof, a home. There is a particular kind of ache that comes when your own child leaves you, but you find salvation in their children. It's like being wounded and healed at the same time. My daughter's absence broke me, but the laughter of those kids in my living room stitched me back together. I taught them how to ride bikes on cracked sidewalks. I sat through spelling bees and science fairs. I made pancakes on Saturday mornings, bad ones, too thin, too burnt, but they always smiled and said they loved them. They started calling me dad sometimes by accident, and I never corrected them, because in all the ways that mattered I was. People asked me, don't you ever get tired? Don't you ever wish you could just rest? Of course I did. But every time I felt that weight pressing down, I remembered the look on their faces that first night. Lost, afraid. And I promised myself they would never feel that way again. So yes, I gave up retirement. I gave up long naps and quiet mornings, the life of leisure I once imagined. But in return, I got drawings taped to the refrigerator. I got bedtime stories and warm little arms around my neck. I got to be needed. And let me tell you something. There is no greater purpose in a man's life than to be needed. I didn't know then what storms were still ahead. I didn't know my daughter would come back one day, ready to take everything I had built. I didn't know there would be lawyers and betrayals, or that my love would be tested in front of the world. All I knew that first night was this: retirement could wait, love could not. The first morning after they came, the house felt strange. Not empty, not full, something in between. For years my home had been quiet, the kind of quiet you don't notice until it's gone. Now there were cereal bowls clinking, shoelaces dragging on the floor, the sudden thump of little feet running down the hallway. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, and watched them. Two kids, my grandkids, eating in silence, shoulders hunched like they were trying to make themselves smaller. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look up. They just ate. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like theirs. And in a way, that was the best gift life could have given me. I didn't know the rhythms of children anymore. It had been decades since I'd packed a lunchbox or checked a backpack for homework. So I stumbled. I burned toast. I forgot which days required gym shoes. I left permission slips unsigned. But children are forgiving creatures. Every mistake I made, they smoothed over with small kindnesses. My granddaughter slipped a sticky note onto the fridge that said, "Don't forget lunch money." My grandson showed me how to use the school's online portal, laughing when I fumbled with the password. They were teaching me as much as I was teaching them. Nights were the hardest. When the lights went out and the house shrank back into shadows, I could hear them whispering in the bedroom down the hall. Not playful whispers, but the kind of murmurs children use when they are afraid. They didn't talk about their mother, not directly. But I could hear the ache in their voices, the way a child wonders if they did something wrong to make her leave. I never knew how to answer those questions. So instead of words, I gave them presents. I sat by their beds until they fell asleep. I left the door cracked open, a wedge of hallway light cutting through the dark. And when they stirred in the middle of the night, they always found me there, sitting in the recliner, pretending to doze. That was my way of saying, "You are not alone." The house itself began to change. What was once tidy and predictable slowly filled with color. There were soccer cleats by the door, hair ties on the bathroom sink, crayon drawings curling at the edges of the refrigerator. The living room floor was no longer smooth and polished. It was littered with puzzle pieces, Lego towers, and half-finished board games. I used to keep everything in order, but the mess felt like proof of life, proof that the walls were echoing with something more than the hum of the old refrigerator. I would come home from work, step over backpacks, and feel a warmth that no heater could give me. It was chaos, yes, but it was ours. There were small victories that stitched us together, like the first time my granddaughter baked cookies without burning them, or when my grandson finally scored a goal at his soccer game, running straight toward me in the bleachers with arms wide open. They weren't milestones anyone else would write down, but to me they were signs that the house was no longer a stopgap, no longer a waiting room for something better. It was becoming home. And a home, I realized, isn't about furniture or fresh paint. It's about belonging. Sometimes I would catch myself staring at the family photographs on the mantel. Pictures of my daughter when she was young, pigtails, toothless grin, a gap where her front teeth used to be. She looked so much like her daughter does now. It was impossible not to see her face in the children I was raising. That was the hardest part. Every smile, every laugh, every tilt of their heads reminded me of the daughter I lost long before she walked out the door. Because the truth is, I had been losing her for years. I just hadn't wanted to admit it. Still, I refused to let that shadow touch the kids. They deserved light. So I gave them what I could, a steady hand, a listening ear, and a roof that wouldn't collapse under the weight of disappointment. One night, after homework and dishes and the usual bedtime rituals, I found myself in the living room alone. The kids were asleep. The house had settled into that deep, late-night quiet. I sank into the couch, stared at the ceiling, and felt something swell in my chest. It wasn't exhaustion, though I was tired down to my bones. It wasn't sadness, though sorrow lingered in the corners of every room. It was fullness. A fullness I hadn't known I was missing. An empty house had turned into a beating heart. It was fragile, yes, and built on sacrifice. But it was alive. And for the first time in a long time, so was I. The first time I sat down with my checkbook after the kids moved in, I felt the weight of numbers more than ever. Retirement had always been a math problem, how much I had saved, how long it would last. Now it wasn't math, it was survival. I spread the bills across the kitchen table. Electric, water, gas, school lunch accounts already overdue. One notice for field trip money, $25 each. And in the corner, like a stone, I couldn't move. My mortgage statement. My pension check came once a month, $1,218. It looked like more on paper than it ever did in practice. Groceries swallowed half of it before the week was done. Shoes for growing feet, coats for winter that always came too fast, prescriptions for my aching back. Every expense ate away at the edges until there was nothing left but crumbs. I used to count dollars in terms of what they could buy for me. A fishing rod, a new recliner, maybe a trip down south. Now I counted dollars in cartons of milk, in boxes of cereal, in bus passes and school supplies. Money stopped being mine. It became theirs. One afternoon, I walked into the grocery store with $40 tucked into my wallet. I left with 38 spent and a pocket full of change that barely jingled. I remember standing at the register, staring at the total, praying it wouldn't creep higher than the bills in my hand. When the cashier handed me back a single crumpled dollar, I exhaled like I had just cleared a mountain. It's funny, the things you learn to measure. I began clipping coupons, circling items in the Sunday paper. Generic brands filled my cart. Pasta stretched across 3 meals. Every purchase became a small calculation. Do they need it? Or do I just want to feel like a better grandfather by buying it? I almost never chose the second. At night, after the kids were asleep, I'd sit with the calculator. The screen glowed green in the dim light, numbers shuffling into shapes that never seemed to fit. I'd punch in tuition for after-school care, then erase it. Too expensive. I'd add piano lessons my granddaughter wanted, then delete it again. Maybe next year, maybe never. That was the hardest part, telling them not now. Not because I didn't want to, but because the quarters in the jar by the fridge weren't enough. I could handle my own sacrifices, but theirs, that was the wound I carried quiet. There were moments of unexpected grace. A neighbor dropped off a bag of hand-me-down clothes. The church covered part of the school supply drive. A friend slipped me a grocery card just in case. It wasn't charity, it was survival dressed as kindness. And every little bit reminded me that I wasn't raising these children in isolation. There was a village, even if it only showed up in glimpses. Still, the burden was mine to carry, and I carried it in the smallest denominations. Once my grandson came into the kitchen while I was bent over the bills. He asked why I always looked so tired at the table. I smiled and told him I was just doing math. He offered me 2 quarters from his piggy bank, said maybe it would help. I had to turn away before he saw my eyes water, because in that moment the truth of it struck me. These kids didn't need a grandfather with money. They needed a man who wouldn't quit. The house began to echo with phrases I never thought I'd use again. Turn off the lights, electricity costs money. We can't eat out, we'll make something here. Shoes can last one more season. I became the kind of father who stretched everything thin, hoping love would cover what money could not. And somehow, it did. Every dollar I spent on them was a dollar I could never get back for myself. But somewhere in that subtraction, I discovered a strange kind of wealth. Not the kind you deposit in a bank. The kind that shows up in report cards pinned to the fridge. In hugs so fierce they nearly knock you over. In the way 2 children look at you as if you hung the moon even when you're worrying about keeping the lights on. I counted pennies, yes, but I was also counting blessings. One never felt like enough. The other always did. There are burdens you can put down at the end of the day, and then there are the ones you carry even in your sleep. For me, it was the weight of exhaustion, the kind that settles in your bones and doesn't leave, the kind you hide behind a smile so the kids won't see. I had promised myself they would never feel the cracks in the walls, never sense the tremors of worry that kept me up at night, so I swallowed my weariness. I stitched it shut with routine. And I tried to make the rhythm of our days feel steady, even when I was unraveling inside. I picked up shifts wherever I could, warehouse floors, stocking shelves, sometimes overnight, sometimes weekends. The kind of work men my age aren't built for anymore. My back barked at me, stiff from years of labor, but I ignored it. My hands ached, joints swollen like old hinges, but I pressed on. I wore my fatigue like an invisible coat, heavy but necessary. In the mornings, when the alarm rang after only a few hours of sleep, I moved quietly so I wouldn't wake the kids. I splashed cold water on my face, rubbed at the red veins in my eyes, and forced myself upright. The mirror showed me an old man fraying at the edges. But when I stepped into the hallway and saw their doors closed, the sound of their breathing steady and soft, I told myself, keep going. I never let them see the missed meals, the skipped lunches when I was working through the day. I told them I wasn't hungry, that I'd eaten earlier. The truth was, I wanted them to have the last sandwich, the last apple, whatever scraps were left. When they asked why I always looked tired, I joked that grown-ups just ran on less sleep. What I didn't tell them was how I'd sit in the car after work, gripping the steering wheel, too drained to even turn the key. How sometimes I'd close my eyes and let the silence wrap around me like a blanket because I couldn't imagine walking through the door with a smile already fixed in place. But even in struggle, there were small mercies. A neighbor waving from the porch saying I looked strong. A coworker who covered half my shift so I could leave early. Moments when kindness slipped through the cracks, reminding me I wasn't invisible. Still, most nights ended the same way. I'd tuck the kids into bed, kiss their foreheads, and watch their eyelids flutter shut. Then I'd retreat to the living room, sit in the dark, and let my body finally admit how tired it was. The chair beneath me groaned. My knees throbbed. And in the quiet, I would whisper to no one, just one more day. You only have to make it one more day. There were times I thought about calling my daughter, asking for help, begging her to come back if only for their sake. But pride, or maybe fear, kept me silent. What if she didn't answer? What if she did but came back only to take more than she gave? So instead, I fought my battles alone. My war wasn't on a field. It was in grocery aisles and gas stations, in the clock punching me out at dawn, in the trembling of my hands as I tried to button a shirt after 12 hours on my feet. The kids didn't notice, not fully. Children see more than we think, but they also choose what to believe. They believed their grandfather was strong, unshakable, always ready with a joke or a story before bed. And I let them believe it. Because sometimes, the best gift you can give children is the illusion of security, even when you're holding it together with frayed string. I learned to rest in fragments, 10 minutes with my eyes closed in the pickup line at school, 50 minutes leaning against the washing machine while it rattled through another load of laundry. Sleep wasn't measured in hours anymore, but in scraps. And somehow, I convinced myself it was enough. There was one evening I won't forget. I came home late, later than I promised. My granddaughter had stayed up, sitting at the table with a glass of milk, waiting for me. When I walked in, bone-tired and hunched, she said, "You look sad, Grandpa." I froze, unsure what to say. But then she slid the glass of milk toward me, as if that was all it took to fix the cracks in the world. And for a moment, it did. I realized then that even in my silence, even in the struggle I thought I was hiding, they were reaching back toward me, offering comfort in the only ways they knew how. And maybe that was enough to keep me going, to keep the fight invisible, to keep the love visible. Year 3. After 2 school years, the house finally knew our names. The days never seemed easy, but some days gave me just enough to keep going. Not grand victories, not miracles, just small, almost invisible moments that reminded me why the fight was worth it. One Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of something burning. I rushed into the kitchen, half expecting disaster, and found my granddaughter standing on a chair, holding a spatula like it was a sword. The pan was smoking, the pancakes thin as paper and stuck to the skillet. She turned to me with wide eyes, ready to cry, but before she could, I laughed. She looked at me, confused. So I took the spatula, flipped the pancake onto a plate, and pretended to taste it like a food critic. I chewed, nodded solemnly, and declared, "Best pancakes I've ever had." Her frown broke into the kind of grin that makes you forget you're tired. That morning, we ate burnt pancakes together and laughed until the smoke alarm chirped in protest. It wasn't about breakfast. It was about her trying. It was about me seeing that she wanted to give something back, no matter how small. Then there was the soccer game. My grandson wasn't the fastest kid on the field. He wasn't the strongest either. Most games, he spent more time chasing the ball than kicking it. But one afternoon, under a sky heavy with spring rain, the ball rolled straight toward him, and for once his feet and his courage agreed. He kicked. The ball flew in a crooked arc and somehow landed in the net. The crowd barely reacted. It was a little league game after all, but he turned and ran straight to me, arms spread wide as if he'd just won the World Cup. He crashed into my chest, breathless, shouting, "Did you see, Grandpa? Did you see?" I told him I'd never forget it. And I meant it, because in that moment his triumph was mine too. The little wins didn't always come in public. Sometimes they arrived quietly in the folds of ordinary days, like the night my granddaughter brought home a spelling test with a bright red A at the top. She laid it on the table without a word, waiting for my reaction. I pulled her into a hug so tight she squealed, and I taped that paper right on the refrigerator door. She kept checking to make sure it was still there, like it might disappear. Or the afternoon my grandson fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom by tightening it with his small hands, proud as any handyman. He called me in to watch the drip stop, grinning as though he'd saved the whole house from flooding. We high-fived like it was the biggest accomplishment in the world. These moments stitched together into something larger than survival. They became proof that love, even when worn thin by struggle, could still bear fruit, and each small victory was a reminder the sacrifices weren't for nothing. Still, the victories weren't just theirs. They were mine too, because every time I saw them succeed, I felt a piece of myself heal. Every laugh, every hug, every proud glance, they patched the wounds I carried from my daughter's absence. It was as if their joy was a kind of medicine, stronger than any pill a doctor could prescribe. One evening, after a long day, I sat down in my chair, ready to collapse. The kids disappeared into their room, whispering. I didn't think much of it, but a few minutes later they came back with a piece of paper folded neatly. On the front, in uneven handwriting, were the words, "For Grandpa." I opened it and found a drawing me standing between the two of them holding their hands. Above our heads was a big yellow sun, smiling. At the bottom, in shaky letters, they had written, "Best Dad and Grandpa." I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe for a moment. I just pulled them both into my arms, my throat thick with a mix of pride and sorrow, because in their eyes I wasn't just filling a role. I was the role. It's strange how the smallest things can weigh more than the heaviest burdens. A test taped to a fridge, a soccer goal in the rain, a drawing with a crooked sun. Those little wins kept me upright. They reminded me that while the struggle was silent, the love was loud. And sometimes, the sound of a child's laughter is enough to drown out the noise of everything else. The fifth winter. It had been years since the night she left. Enough time for birthdays to pass without a phone call. Enough time for school concerts, spelling bees, soccer games, and report cards to come and go with no mother in sight. We had settled into our own rhythm, the three of us. Not perfect, not easy, but steady. So when I opened the front door one evening and found her standing there, I almost didn't recognize her. Her hair was darker, cut short. Her clothes looked sharper, as if life had given her a polish she never had before. But her eyes, those restless, darting eyes, hadn't changed at all. She didn't say hello. She just whispered, "Dad, can I come in?" The kids were in the living room working on a puzzle. When they heard her voice, their heads snapped up. For a second, neither of them moved. Then my granddaughter rose slowly, uncertain, while my grandson stayed frozen, clutching a puzzle piece in his small fist. Their mother stepped inside as if she owned the space, her perfume filling the air that had once only smelled of crayons and laundry detergent. She knelt down, arms open. "Look at you two, you've grown so much." My granddaughter hesitated, then walked into her arms. My grandson didn't move. He looked at me, eyes wide, searching for something I didn't know how to give him, permission, maybe, or reassurance. I nodded. Only then did he shuffle forward, stiff and uncertain, and let her hug him. I stood in the doorway, silent, my chest tightening. I had dreamed of this moment once, back when the nights were long and the questions from the kids were endless. But now that it was here, it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a storm cloud pressing against the roof. We sat at the kitchen table after the kids went to bed. The puzzle still lay unfinished in the other room. She told me she wanted to come back. She told me she'd changed, that she was ready to be a mother again. Her words were smooth, rehearsed, almost like lines from a script, but I heard the gaps between them. "Dad, I know I made mistakes," she said, twisting the ring on her finger. "But I was young, lost. I didn't know what I was doing. Now I want a second chance." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to, because part of me still remembered the little girl who used to run down these same hallways, hair flying, laughter bouncing off the walls. But the man I had become, the one who had tucked in her children every night, wiped their tears, packed their lunches, he knew better than to mistake words for change. The days that followed were uneasy. She visited more often, sometimes bringing gifts. New sneakers, shiny toys, things the kids didn't need but couldn't help being dazzled by. I watched their eyes light up, watched them cling to her like a dream they'd nearly forgotten. And I stood back, biting my tongue, trying not to let bitterness spill out, because how could I compete with glitter and promises when all I had to offer was steadiness and sacrifice? I saw the confusion growing in them. My granddaughter asked me one night, "Grandpa, is Mommy staying this time?" I didn't know what to say. I kissed her forehead and told her, "We'll see." But inside I feared the truth. Storms rarely stay away forever. One Sunday afternoon she came by again. This time she wasn't alone. A man in a tailored suit trailed behind her carrying a briefcase. She introduced him casually like it was nothing. "Dad, this is Mark. He's helping me with some legal paperwork." The word legal stuck in my throat like a splinter. And as I looked at the briefcase, at the way her smile tightened around the edges, I understood something I hadn't before. She hadn't just come back for them. She had come back for more. The house that was never hers. The life I had built from the ashes she left behind. The children who looked at me not just as grandpa but as dad. She wanted to reclaim them all. That night after they left, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The puzzle pieces were still scattered where the kids had abandoned them. I picked one up, turned it over in my hand and felt the edges bite into my skin. It hit me then. This wasn't just about her return. It was about the fight that was coming. A fight I never asked for. A fight I knew could break us in ways I wasn't sure we could mend. But if there's one thing I had learned, it was this. Love isn't proven in the easy times. It's proven in the storms. And the storm had just walked back through my door. The letter came folded in a cream envelope, heavy with the kind of weight paper shouldn't carry. It wasn't a birthday card. It wasn't a school notice. It was from a law office, printed in bold type across the top. I sat at the kitchen table, the kids' school projects scattered around me, and read each line slowly. Words like custody and petition and rights leapt out, cold and sharp. By the end of the page, my hands were trembling. She wasn't just visiting anymore. She was demanding the children back, demanding control, demanding in the language of lawyers what love had already earned me. When she came by that weekend, she didn't look ashamed. She didn't even look nervous. She strolled in with that same man in the tailored suit and set her purse down like she was returning home. "Dad," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "I've filed for custody. It's the right thing. I'm their mother." I stared at her across the table, the same table where I had taught her children their times tables, the same table where I had cut their sandwiches, where they had drawn pictures of suns and stick figures. "You left them," I said quietly. My voice shook, not with rage but with something deeper. "You left them with me when they needed you most." She folded her arms, defensive. "I was young. I made mistakes, but I'm back now. They deserve their mother. And legally, Dad, I have every right." It wasn't just about the children. I could see it in her eyes. Behind the talk of second chances, there was calculation. She had mentioned my retirement account. She had asked about the deed to the house. And now in the legal papers there was a clause, language about guardianship, about inheritance, about assets she believed she could control once the children were in her care. She wasn't just reclaiming motherhood. She was reclaiming ownership. I met with my own lawyer in a cramped office downtown. A kind woman with gray streaks in her hair and glasses perched low on her nose. She read the documents with a frown, tapping her pen against the desk. "She has standing," she said finally. "She's their biological mother. The law is often slow to weigh history against blood." "History?" I asked, my voice breaking. "History is every scraped knee I bandaged, every night I stayed up when they were sick, every dollar I spent when I should have been resting. How does blood outweigh that?" The lawyer sighed, setting the papers aside. "I understand, but courts look at rights, not sacrifice. We'll have to build your case on proof, documentation, receipts." That word lingered, receipts, as if love needed evidence, as if bedtime stories could be notarized or hugs could be stapled to affidavits. The kids didn't know, not at first. I shielded them from the letters, the meetings, the calls that made my stomach churn. But children are sharper than we give them credit for. My grandson asked one evening, "Grandpa, why were you talking to that lady in the office?" I told him she was helping me with paperwork. He frowned. "Are we in trouble?" I shook my head quickly, too quickly. "No, buddy, not you." But the truth was, yes, we were in trouble, not because of anything we had done, but because someone else wanted to rewrite the story we had built together. At night, I lay awake listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering how much more I could bear. I thought about the years I'd lost, the savings I'd drained, the aches in my body that would never fully heal. And now to face the possibility of losing them, not to time, not to fate, but to someone who had walked away without looking back. It was a cruelty I hadn't prepared for. Still, a strange kind of fire burned beneath the fear. I remembered my lawyer's words, proof, documentation, receipts, and I began gathering. Bank statements, school forms signed in my hand, medical bills addressed to me. Photographs of birthdays, Christmas mornings, soccer games, science fairs, all the moments she had missed, frozen in print with me standing right there. Each piece felt like both a weapon and a wound. Evidence of how much I had given, evidence of how much she had abandoned. The children didn't see the boxes I filled. They didn't know the nights I sat at the table, labeling manila folders with dates and receipts. They only knew that something was changing, that their mother was smiling more than she used to, promising more than she ever had. And I knew sooner or later they would be asked to choose between what was legal and what was love. A choice no child should ever have to make. It started with a picture. A bright, polished photo of her with the kids, standing outside an ice cream shop. The kind of staged smile you only hold for a camera. She posted it online with the caption, "So grateful to be reunited with my babies. Nothing stronger than a mother's love." The comments poured in, "Beautiful family. So glad you're back together. Those kids are lucky to have you." I saw it because my neighbor showed me her phone glowing in the evening light. She meant no harm, just thought I'd want to see. But when I looked at that picture, at the way my grandchildren were smiling shyly into the lens, my stomach turned. Lucky, if only they knew. The photos multiplied. Trips to the park, pizza nights, selfies with the kids in the backseat of her car, always with captions that painted her as the devoted mother who had fought through hard times and come out stronger. The story spread. In the grocery store, people nodded at her with warm smiles. At church, I overheard whispers about how she had really turned her life around. Even the principal at the kids' school pulled me aside, saying, "It's good to see their mom back in the picture." Back in the picture. That phrase stung, because no one asked who had been in the picture all along. No one asked who had kept the lights on, who had walked those kids to class every day, who had been there in the middle of the night when fever spiked. I could have shouted the truth. I could have posted my own photos, written long captions about the years she was gone. But I didn't. Partly because I didn't know how, partly because something in me resisted turning love into a headline. She knew the game. I didn't. And in this new world where image was currency, she was spending freely while I sat on the sidelines silent. The kids began to feel it too. At school, classmates mentioned the posts. "Your mom takes you everywhere now. Your mom makes the best cookies, right?" They came home confused, asking questions I couldn't answer. "Why does everyone think mommy's been here all along?" I didn't want to poison them with bitterness, so I told them gently. Sometimes people only see part of the story. But inside, it broke me, because the part they were seeing wasn't the truth. It was a polished version crafted for sympathy, designed to erase me. The lawyer warned me this would happen. "She's building credibility," she said, tapping the printed posts with her pen. "Courts notice public perception, whether they admit it or not. If she looks stable, devoted, involved, it strengthens her case." So while I was gathering receipts, she was gathering applause. And applause is louder than paper. One evening, she invited the kids to a community fundraiser. It was the kind of event where families posed for group photos, where names were mentioned over a microphone, where reputation was built with handshakes and smiles. She stood on stage with them at her side, thanking everyone for supporting single mothers like me. Her voice carried through the speakers, strong and sure. The crowd clapped, some even cheered. And my grandchildren, too young to understand, smiled nervously, tugging at their sleeves, caught in the spotlight of a story they didn't write. I sat in the back, unseen, my fists tight in my lap. I wanted to stand, to shout, to say, "She's rewriting history." Those kids were never alone because I was here. I was always here, but no one would have listened. The narrative was already too neat, too shiny. When we got home that night, my grandson asked, "Grandpa, why did everyone clap for Mom?" I swallowed hard, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "people clap for the story they hear, not the one that's true." He frowned, puzzled, then crawled onto the couch beside me. "Then maybe we should tell the real one." His words lingered long after he fell asleep, because he was right. The truth was sitting in boxes in my living room, documents, bills, photos, but it wasn't alive. It wasn't loud. And in a world that clapped for shiny captions, truth needed a voice, not just a file. I didn't know then how that voice would come, but deep down I felt the tide shifting. Her game was public. Ours would be too. Started subtly, the way most shifts in a small town do. Not with loud announcements, but with glances, with murmurs that traveled faster than the wind. At the grocery store, the cashier who used to ask about the kids now asked about their mother. "How wonderful that she stepped back in," she said brightly, scanning my bread and milk. I nodded politely, though my stomach tightened. At church, the pastor mentioned her in a sermon, how forgiveness and redemption could heal any wound. Heads turned toward me in the pew as if I should be nodding in agreement. I sat still, hands folded, my jaw locked. Even at the post office, a neighbor leaned over the counter and said, "Your daughter looks so happy in those pictures. You must be proud." Proud. The word felt like a stone in my throat. The story she'd woven online had begun to spill into every corner of our town. People didn't just see her as a returning mother. They saw her as a hero, a woman who had lost her way but fought to reclaim her children. And in the shadow of that story, I was fading. No one asked about the years in between. The soccer practices in the rain, the late-night homework sessions, the doctor's appointments, the empty bank account. No one asked about the toll, the gray hair that wasn't there before, the lines etched deeper into my face. The story was too simple, too satisfying. The mother had returned. The grandfather, he was a placeholder, nothing more. The kids felt the shift too. My granddaughter came home from school one afternoon, quiet, her eyes downcast. Finally, she whispered, "Grandpa, my friend said I was lucky my mom raised me so well." I froze, my throat burned, but I forced a smile. "She doesn't know the whole story," I said gently. But the words felt weak, flimsy against the weight pressing on her small shoulders. My grandson grew defensive, snapping at classmates who repeated what their parents had read online. He came home angry, fists clenched, saying, "Why do they think she did everything? She wasn't there." I pulled him close, told him the truth mattered even if others couldn't see it. But I could feel the ground shifting beneath us, and I wasn't sure how long we could stand upright. At the diner downtown, I overheard a conversation at the next booth. Two women sipping coffee, scrolling on their phones. "That mother's really turned her life around," one said. "Imagine the strength it takes to come back like that." The other nodded. Meanwhile, the grandfather must have been overwhelmed. Poor man probably couldn't manage on his own. I sat there with my coffee growing cold, my heart pounding. Overwhelmed. I had given everything, and now my everything was being rewritten as failure. The final straw came at the school fundraiser. Every year I baked pies for the auction. Terrible pies, if I'm honest, but people bought them out of kindness. This year she arrived with a tray of cupcakes, perfectly frosted, boxes tied with ribbons. The crowd swarmed her table. Compliments flew like confetti. And when the principal thanked the mothers who go above and beyond, the applause rang in my ears like thunder. I stood in the back, clutching my unsold pies, feeling smaller than I ever had before. Later that night, back at home, I washed the empty pie tins while the kids sat at the table. My granddaughter finally spoke. "Grandpa, why does everyone think Mommy's the hero?" Her voice cracked, fragile, full of confusion, and I didn't have an answer, because in that moment I realized it wasn't just about the community's perception. It was about the children. Their reality was being bent, reshaped by the voices around them, by the constant praise showered on someone who hadn't earned it. The truth was slipping away, and I feared that if I didn't find a way to hold it steady, even my grandchildren might begin to believe the story that wasn't theirs. That night, long after they'd gone to bed, I sat alone at the table. The house was quiet, but my mind was not. Every whisper, every comment, every clap of hands at the fundraiser echoed in my head. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was mine too, not only in court but in the court of public opinion. Because a lie told often enough in a small town doesn't just spread. It settles. It becomes the truth people carry with them to church pews, grocery aisles, and coffee shops. And once it settles, it's almost impossible to shake loose. After 2 school years in my care, a hearing was set on short notice. A temporary order followed. The day they left wasn't stormy. It wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon with sunlight falling across the kitchen floor in thin stripes. The kind of day that should have meant nothing, but it meant everything. She arrived with her lawyer, papers in hand, and a court order granting her temporary custody. Temporary. That word was supposed to comfort me, but when I read it, all I saw was absence. The kids didn't understand. They only saw suitcases by the door, packed neatly with clothes I had folded myself the night before, hands shaking the whole time. They saw their mother's smile, wide and bright, promising weekends at the park, promises of fun that outshined the quiet steadiness of home. My granddaughter clung to me, whispering, "Do we have to go?" My grandson stood stiff, jaw tight, trying not to cry. I knelt down, held them both, and told them something I wasn't sure I believed. "It's just for a little while." The sound of the door closing behind them hollowed out the house. The silence afterward was deafening. No cartoons humming in the background. No shoes kicked off by the door. No voices arguing over who got the last cookie. Just me and the echo of everything I had lost. I sat at the kitchen table for hours, the sunlight fading until the house was swallowed by darkness. I didn't move. I didn't eat. I didn't even turn on a lamp, because what was the point of light when the heart of the house had been carried away? The first night was the hardest. I walked down the hall by instinct, stopping at their rooms. The beds were neatly made, untouched. The smell of their shampoo lingered in the air, ghost-like. I sat on the edge of my grandson's bed, stared at the empty pillow, and felt the weight of years collapse onto my chest. I had spent so long building a life around them. Every routine, every sacrifice, every tired morning and late night, it was all for them. And now the house felt like a museum of a life that no longer existed. People told me to rest. They said, "At least now you can catch your breath." But rest without purpose is just emptiness. Every moment stretched too long, every hour dragged like a stone. The days blurred together and the nights were unbearable. I kept the porch light on, though, not for me, for them. Some foolish part of me believed they might come back on their own, walk through the door, run into my arms like they used to. The porch light was my signal to the dark. I'm still here. I'm still waiting. At the grocery store, I passed by the cereal aisle and stopped, staring at the boxes I used to buy for them. My cart was empty except for bread and milk. For the first time in years, I didn't need to think about lunches or after-school snacks. And instead of relief, it felt like betrayal. Because what is a grandfather, what is a father without someone to care for? I had lost not just their presence, but the very purpose that kept me alive. The town didn't help. Whispers followed me, some with pity, some with judgment. "It's good the kids are back with their mom," but he was too old to handle it. I wanted to shout, to tell them what love had cost me, to tell them the truth of every night I stayed awake so those children could sleep peacefully. But the words stayed trapped in my chest, heavy and useless. One night, I pulled out the boxes I had been gathering, the receipts, the bank statements, the photos. I spread them across the table like a timeline of devotion. There was the bill for braces, the prescription for an ear infection, the photo of a science fair ribbon pinned proudly to my granddaughter's shirt. Each piece was proof, but none of it filled the empty chairs beside me. I placed my hand on the pile of papers, and for the first time in years I prayed out loud, not for strength, not for justice, just for them to remember who was there in the silence, in the struggle, in the nights when the world forgot them. The heart can only break when it has been full. Mine had been overflowing, and now it sat shattered in the quiet, waiting for a sound that wouldn't come. It was a week after they had gone when my phone buzzed late at night. I didn't recognize the number. I almost ignored it, but something told me to look. It was a message, a link, and above it, in shaky spelling, the words, "For you, Grandpa." My hands trembled as I tapped the screen. The video filled the room with their voices. It opened on my grandson's face, half lit by the glow of a lamp. He was whispering, careful not to be overheard. "Hi, Grandpa," he said, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. We just wanted to say thank you." The camera wobbled, and then my granddaughter appeared beside him, holding the phone steady now. Her voice was soft but steady. "Mom tells everyone she raised us," she said, lips pressed tight. "But that's not true, you did." My chest tightened. I leaned forward, gripping the phone as if it might vanish. They began listing things. Not rehearsed, not polished, just memories tumbling out like pebbles from a pocket. "You packed our lunches every day. You stayed up when I had nightmares. You worked even when you were tired so we could have shoes and books. You taught us how to ride bikes, remember? I fell 3 times, but you kept running behind me." Their voices overlapped, eager, desperate to fit everything in. It was like they feared time might run out before they could say it all. Then my granddaughter looked straight into the camera, eyes shining. "You're not just our grandpa, you're our dad, you always were." I covered my mouth with my hand. Tears blurred the screen until their faces became streaks of light. I wanted to reach through, to pull them close, to tell them I'd never needed thanks, only their love. But hearing those words spoken in secret was more than I could bear. The video wasn't long, maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. But in those minutes, they gave me something no court could take away. They gave me truth, undeniable, unshakable truth. When it ended, I replayed it again and again, memorizing every word, every glance. Their voices filled the empty house, echoing down the hallways that had been too silent for too long. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the table with the phone in front of me, the glow casting soft light across the piles of receipts and documents. All the evidence I had gathered, all the proof I thought I needed, none of it was as powerful as this. Because this wasn't paper. This was love speaking for itself. The next morning, the video appeared online. I don't know how they managed it, whether they posted it themselves or asked a friend for help. But there it was, spreading across feeds, across towns, across strangers' screens. The title was simple, "For Our Grandpa," And within hours, comments poured in. People from other states, other countries, writing things like, "This is real love. He's the father they needed. Someone give this man the recognition he deserves." The same community that had clapped for polished cupcakes and pretty captions now clapped for something raw, unfiltered, undeniable. I didn't post it. I didn't ask for it. But the truth had found its way into the world, carried on the voices of two children who had seen everything, remembered everything, and refused to let it be erased. By evening, local news outlets had picked it up. Reporters called, asking for interviews. I declined them all. This wasn't my story to spin. It was theirs, and they had told it better than I ever could. That night I sat on the porch with the phone in my hand, replaying the video once more. The porch light glowed just as it had every night since they left. But for the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting in the dark. Because even if the house was empty, their voices filled it. Even if the court tried to measure rights in paperwork, love had already declared its verdict. And in that quiet moment, I whispered back to the glowing screen, "I hear you. I always hear you." By morning, the video had grown wings. What began as a whisper between two children and their grandfather was now roaring across the internet. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing nonstop on the nightstand. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some glitch, some wrong number. But when I opened the screen, I saw notification after notification. Messages from numbers I didn't know, comments from people I had never met, thousands of them. The view count on the video was climbing faster than I could refresh. 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. By noon, it had crossed 1 million. The kids' words were being shared everywhere. Clips on morning talk shows, articles with headlines like, "Grandchildren Speak Out, the Hidden Hero Who Raised Them." Strangers stitched the video into their own, wiping tears from their eyes, saying, "This is what love looks like." The same world that once believed the shiny captions and polished photos was now seeing something raw, not rehearsed, not staged. Just two children telling the truth from a bedroom lit by a single lamp. And the truth was louder than any performance. Neighbors stopped me on the street, their voices softer than before. I had no idea, one woman whispered, shame in her eyes. At the grocery store, the cashier who once praised my daughter now handed me my receipt and said, "God bless you for what you've done." Even at church, where the sermon had once painted her as redeemed, the pastor pulled me aside and said, "We owe you an apology, we see it now." The tide had turned, not because of me. Not because of lawyers or receipts or bank statements, but because two children had lifted their voices higher than the noise of gossip. Of course, not everyone was pleased. My daughter's online posts turned defensive. She wrote long captions about misunderstandings, about how children don't always see the full picture. But the comments beneath told a different story. People demanded answers. They asked why she had been gone. They asked why the children's gratitude didn't match her narrative. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the story, and she hated it. News vans began parking at the edge of our street. Reporters knocked on my door, microphones ready, cameras rolling. I told them no. I wasn't interested in fame and spectacle. I only wanted the truth to breathe, and it already was. But even as I shut the door, I couldn't ignore the hum outside, the sound of the world watching. My porch light, once a lonely beacon in the dark, now felt like it was shining across the country. The kids called me the second night after it went viral. Their voices crackled through the line, excitement bubbling. "Grandpa, did you see? Everyone knows now." My granddaughter laughed, the sound light and free. "We told them," she said proudly. "They can't erase you anymore." I pressed the phone to my ear, eyes closed, swallowing the lump in my throat. I didn't tell them how afraid I was of the backlash, of what their mother might do next. I didn't tell them how strange it felt to be at the center of a story I never asked for. I only said, "I'm proud of you both, more than you'll ever know." That night, I scrolled through the comments, though I told myself I wouldn't. Some were angry, some were emotional, some were simple. "I see you, Grandpa. You are what love looks like. Every child deserves someone like you." I sat in the dark, reading until my eyes blurred, until my chest ached from the weight of strangers' kindness. It didn't erase the years of struggle. It didn't bring the children back into the house. But it reminded me that truth, once spoken, doesn't vanish. It grows, it spreads, and it cannot be silenced. Video didn't just change the conversation. It shattered the illusion my daughter had built. The cupcakes, the photo ops, the captions about redemption, all of it looked hollow now, paper-thin against the raw voices of her children. The world wasn't clapping for her anymore. They were clapping for us. For the bond we had forged in sacrifice, in quiet nights, in burnt pancakes and scraped knees. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. Not by the cameras, not by the crowds, but by the two voices that had always mattered most. The internet has a way of turning fast. One day it lifts you up. The next it drags you down. For weeks my daughter had ridden high on praise, her photos polished, her captions polished even more. But after the children's video spread, the ground shifted beneath her feet, and suddenly the applause stopped. At first the comments were cautious. People asked gentle questions under her posts. Where were you in those years the kids talked about? Why didn't you mention their grandfather? Then the tone hardened. Screenshots of her old posts, those glossy images of ice cream cones and playground selfies, were shared side by side with the children's words. The contrast was damning. Accusations filled the thread. You tried to erase him. You don't get to claim sacrifices you didn't make. Motherhood isn't a performance. Her replies grew defensive, then desperate. She wrote long paragraphs about redemption, about second chances, about how complicated life could be. But the world no longer believed her. The community shifted too. Neighbors who once smiled at her in the grocery aisles now avoided her cart. At church, the same pews that once held whispers of forgiveness now held silence when she entered. Even the principal, who had praised her cupcakes at the fundraiser, sent a careful email acknowledging the invaluable role of guardians like grandparents. She wasn't just losing a case, she was losing credibility. I didn't gloat, how could I? This wasn't about winning or losing, it was about truth finally breaking through the noise, but still I felt a weight lift. For the first time I wasn't the one on trial in the court of public opinion. She was. One evening I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, she stood there, shoulders slumped, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. The woman who had once walked into my house with the confidence of someone reclaiming territory now looked smaller, diminished. "Dad," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I let her in. We sat at the same kitchen table that had seen so many battles, so many silences. She didn't start with excuses this time. She started with tears. "They hate me," she whispered, staring at her hands. "Everywhere I look, people are saying I'm a liar, a thief. They're attacking me, Dad." I wanted to remind her of what she had done, of the years she had abandoned, of the way she had twisted the story, tried to take credit for what was never hers. But looking at her broken, I only said, "The truth has a way of catching up." She winced as if the words were too sharp. Then she muttered, "I never thought they'd believe the kids over me." That sentence landed like a stone in my chest, because even now, even here, she wasn't seeing them as children, her children. She was seeing them as obstacles, as voices that had betrayed the image she wanted. I realized then that reckoning wasn't just about her reputation crumbling. It was about me finally seeing her clearly without the filter of hope. The backlash didn't stop. Articles multiplied. Commentators dissected every move she had made. Even national outlets picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about image versus truth. Her lawyer tried to salvage the custody case, but the damage was done. Judges read newspapers too. They watched television. And though they claimed impartiality, no one could ignore the tidal wave of public opinion crashing against her. I should have felt triumphant. But as I lay in bed at night, the glow of the porch light spilling through the window, I only felt tired, exposed. As if all the private battles of our family had been laid bare for strangers to dissect. Still, when I replayed the children's video, I remembered why it mattered. Not for the world, not for the headlines, but for them, because they had spoken and the world had listened. And no amount of spin, no carefully staged photo could take that away. The reckoning wasn't the end. It wasn't justice served neatly on a plate, but it was a shift, a turning of the tide. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the current carrying us closer to truth, closer to home. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polished wood. It was the kind of place where whispers carried farther than shouts, where every step echoed like a reminder that lives were being measured here. I sat at the long table, my lawyer beside me, folders stacked high with documents, receipts, statements, photos, the silent proof of years lived. Across the aisle sat my daughter, her lawyer whispering in her ear, her face drawn tight. She looked like someone bracing for a storm. And maybe she was. The judge entered, robes heavy, glasses perched low. He called the case, his voice calm but firm: custody, guardianship, the future of two children who should never have been caught in the middle. My daughter's lawyer went first. He spoke of biological rights, of redemption, of second chances. He painted her as a mother who had stumbled but found her footing, who deserved the chance to reclaim what was rightfully hers. I listened, each word striking like a hammer against my ribs, because on paper he wasn't wrong. Blood is a powerful argument. It always has been. Then it was our turn. My lawyer rose, her voice steady. She didn't start with laws, she started with love. She laid out the timeline: 5 years of absence, 5 years of silence. She placed documents on the bench, each one a snapshot of responsibility: medical bills in my name, school enrollment signed by my hand, letters from teachers who had only ever seen me at conferences. And then she did what I hadn't expected. She pulled out her phone and played the video. The courtroom fell silent as the children's voices filled the air. Their faces glowed on the small screen, shaky but clear. "Grandpa, you raised us. You're our dad too. You never let us down." The words echoed against the paneled walls, soft but louder than any argument that had come before. I bowed my head, unable to watch, my hands trembling on the table. When it ended, there was a pause so long it felt like the whole world had stopped breathing. The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together, eyes heavy with thought. My daughter shifted in her seat, her face pale. For the first time I saw her facade crack. Her eyes darted toward me, then away, as if she couldn't bear the weight of what had just been spoken. She tried to speak, tried to explain, but her words tangled. "They're just kids," she said weakly. "They don't understand everything." But the courtroom didn't buy it, because sometimes truth doesn't need age to stand tall. Sometimes it speaks through the mouths of children, pure and undeniable. The judge finally spoke. His voice was calm, measured, but there was something softer beneath it. "I've read the documents. I've heard the arguments, but more than that, I've heard the children." He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses. "And what they've said is clear. Stability, love, and daily presence have shaped their lives. That cannot be ignored." He didn't declare final judgment that day. He said more hearings would follow, more steps to take, but his tone told me enough. The tide had shifted. The truth had entered the record, not just the air. When we left the courthouse, the cameras were waiting. Microphones stretched toward me, questions flying. "Sir, how do you feel about your grandchildren's testimony? Do you think this video changed the case? Are you ready for the possibility of full custody?" I said nothing, because this wasn't about me giving sound bites. It was about two children brave enough to speak the truth when the world was trying to rewrite their story. I walked past the cameras, past the flashing lights, and stood outside on the courthouse steps, the sky wide above me. For the first time in months, I felt air fill my lungs without strain. The fight wasn't over, but something had changed. The silence of sacrifice had been broken. The courtroom had heard not just evidence, but love. And love, once spoken, has a way of lingering, of staying in the air long after the gavel falls. The final hearing came on a gray morning, the kind of sky that couldn't decide between rain and sun, a ceiling of uncertainty over everything. I wore the same suit I'd worn to weddings, funerals, graduations, occasions that marked turning points in a life. This day I knew would be another one. The courtroom was quieter than before. No cameras, no reporters crowding the doors. Just a few faces in the benches, neighbors, maybe, curious strangers, people who had followed the story from a distance. The children sat with a court-appointed advocate, their small hands folded tightly in their laps. They didn't look at their mother, they looked at me. The judge read through the files one last time, his voice even professional. But when he set the papers down, he didn't speak like a man of law. He spoke like a man who had listened. "I've reviewed every document, every statement, every testimony," he began. "Biological ties are significant, but they are not the only measure of parenthood. What matters most in this court's opinion is consistent love, stability, and presence." The room seemed to hold its breath. "These children have been clear," the judge continued. "They have spoken not out of bitterness, but out of gratitude. Their voices carry weight, and their words reflect the life they have lived." He paused, then looked directly at me. "And that life, for these past years, has been in your care." My daughter shifted in her chair, her eyes flashing. She started to rise, but her lawyer tugged her back down. The judge held up a hand. "This is not a punishment," he said firmly. "This is recognition. Recognition that love is more than a claim, it is an action repeated every day, often unseen but undeniable in its impact." The word struck me deep. Recognition. After years of sacrifice, after nights spent counting pennies, after mornings dragging myself out of bed for their sake, someone had finally said aloud what love had already proven. The decision was read into record. Legal guardianship granted to me, custody affirmed by the court, my daughter allowed visitation under terms to be determined. It wasn't victory, it wasn't revenge. It was something quieter, something truer. It was love recognized. The children couldn't contain themselves. When the judge adjourned, they rushed to me, arms flung wide, colliding into my chest with a force that nearly knocked me backward. My grandson whispered, "We're coming home, Grandpa." My granddaughter clung to me, tears wetting my shirt, whispering, "I knew they'd believe us." I held them both, my arms wrapped tight, my eyes closed. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe fully. My daughter didn't approach me. She gathered her bag, her lawyer murmuring in her ear, and slipped out the side door. For a moment, I watched her go, a shadow of the girl I once carried on my shoulders. I felt no anger, no triumph, only sorrow for what she had lost, not in the court but in the hearts of her children. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. The gray sky had parted just enough for a thin band of sunlight to cut through. The kids held my hands as we walked down the steps, their fingers small but firm, gripping as if afraid I might vanish. I squeezed back, silently promising I never would. People we passed smiled, nodded. Some even stopped to say they were glad justice had been done. But justice wasn't the word I carried in my heart. It was love. Love that had been tested, doubted, nearly erased, but now finally acknowledged for what it was. That evening we sat at the kitchen table again, the three of us. Dinner was simple, soup and bread, the kind of meal I could manage after a long day. But to them it was a feast. They laughed, told stories, spilled crumbs on the table. The house, once hollow, was alive again. My granddaughter taped a new drawing to the fridge. This one showed the three of us standing under a sun bigger than the page could hold. At the bottom, in uneven letters, she wrote, "Home." And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe it. The house felt different after the ruling. Not because the walls had changed, not because the furniture had moved, but because the air itself carried a new weight. Or maybe, for the first time in years, it carried none at all. The children's laughter returned, spilling down the hallway, echoing into every room. The refrigerator once again filled with drawings, misspelled words, and crooked hearts, shoes piled by the door, backpacks slumped in the corner. The mess of life, the kind of chaos that makes a house feel like home, had come back to stay. And with it came something else, peace. Peace doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean nothing ever hurts again. It means knowing the storm has passed, even if the sky still holds clouds. My daughter's shadow still lingered. She called sometimes, awkward, her voice strained. She visited under the terms the court had laid down. The children greeted her with politeness, sometimes even warmth, but not with the unquestioning trust they once gave freely. That trust had shifted quietly to me. And though it broke me to see the distance between mother and child, I also knew it wasn't mine to fix. Love cannot be forced. It must be chosen over and over, until it leaves a mark no storm can wash away. Evenings became our sacred time again. Homework spread across the table, soup simmering on the stove, stories traded before bed. I no longer sat awake in the recliner waiting for shoes that never came home. I no longer left the porch light on as a beacon for children who might not return, because now they were here, and the light was inside. One night, as I tucked my grandson in, he asked, "Grandpa, are you tired of us yet?" I laughed, though my throat tightened. "Tired of you? Never." He grinned, burrowed under the blanket, and whispered, "Then you'll always be our dad, too." I sat there long after he closed his eyes, letting the words settle into me. They were heavier than any gavel, more binding than any court order, because they weren't spoken out of duty. They were spoken out of love. I thought often about legacy. Not the kind measured in money or property, but the kind that lingers when you're gone. I had given up my retirement, yes. The plans I once had, quiet mornings, fishing trips, rest, those had vanished the night two children stood in my doorway with backpacks too heavy for their shoulders. But what I gained was something greater. A legacy not of wealth but of presence, of being the one who stayed, the one who cooked the burnt pancakes and taped the spelling tests to the fridge, the one who showed up when no one else did. And I realized as the years stretched forward that this was enough, more than enough. Sometimes when the kids were at school, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and let myself imagine the future. Graduations, weddings, maybe even children of their own one day who would call me great-grandpa. I wouldn't be there forever. Time would claim me as it claims everyone. But I hoped, no, I believed that when that day came, they would carry forward the lessons carved into our years together. That love isn't proven in speeches or in polished photos. It's proven in the quiet, unseen choices, the sacrifice no one claps for, the late nights, the early mornings, the steady hand when everything else shakes. That is legacy. I sometimes think about the video, the one they made in secret, the one that changed everything. I still keep it saved, though I no longer watch it every night. I don't need to, because the words they spoke are etched into me now. Grandpa, you're our dad too. You never let us down. Those words will live longer than I will. And that, I think, is the true measure of a life well lived. I don't tell this story for pity. I don't tell it for applause. I tell it because in every family, in every corner of this country, there is someone quietly holding the world together while no one notices. A grandmother, an uncle, a foster parent, a neighbor. And to them I say this: your love counts. Even if no one sees it now, even if the world overlooks it, love leaves evidence. It leaves footprints in the lives it touches. And someday, in ways you can't imagine, it will be recognized. So here we are. The storm has passed. The children are home. And I, an old man who once thought retirement meant rest, have found instead a different kind of retirement, one filled not with leisure but with love. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Thank you, my friends, for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of family, I ask you to stay with us on this journey. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories still to come. Share this one with someone who might need to hear it, someone carrying a quiet burden, someone who needs to be reminded that love is never wasted. From my family to yours, I wish you health, peace, and the kind of happiness that lasts beyond circumstance. Hold your loved ones close. Cherish the little moments, because in the end, those moments become the legacy we leave behind. God bless you, and may your home always be full of love.